Wait. Okay, you can go.
Buonasera a tutti, good afternoon and good morning. I am Dr. Felicia Caponigri. I'm the Program Director of Notre Dame Law School's program on IP and Technology Law. And I'm so happy to introduce this great event between the AI Society at the University of Padua and our IP program at Notre Dame. Our event today, The Role of Law, Norms, and Technology in Contact Tracing, is a timely exploration of how we're adapting and responding to an important facet of what we might term our new normal in the shadow of the coronavirus, contact tracing. The genesis of this event is, of course, in current events, but its origins are also found in the links that this group of scholars have created over time. Traveling between Italy and the United States and between our institutions, we've historically explored and lived comparative legal analysis in our own research and work. And as we encounter new and unexpected challenges like the coronavirus and consider how to reconcile decisions we must make with privacy law, tech ethics, fundamental rights, and even our own cultural habits, it was evident that continuing a comparative dialogue could only help us answer these new questions we're encountering in our lives and our research. Our IP program at Notre Dame takes a values-oriented approach to IP. We think critically about the role that the law can have in promoting innovation, creativity, and human flourishing. And the AI Society at the University of Padova explores how AI and tech, by extension, are affecting our societies, cultures, and law, and the way we live. So together, we're very excited to think deeply and innovatively about the novel tech and legal issues we're facing, and the manner in which we affront them, how we can positively benefit our collective societies. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers and great participants. We have Professor Andrea Pin, who will be giving preliminary remarks. Professor Pin is an associate professor of comparative public law at the University of Padua and a co-founder of AI Society. He's also the director of Padua's new interdisciplinary degree program in technology and law, and he's been a visiting fellow at Notre Dame. We have Professor Samir Suais, who is an assistant professor at the Physics and Astronomy Department at the University of Padua and a co-founder of the Interdisciplinary AI Society project as well, and he has been a visiting researcher at Princeton. Our roundtable will feature a great group of scholars from Notre Dame. We have Professor Kirsten Martin, the William P. and Hazel B. White Center Professor of Technology Ethics in Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business, a nationally recognized expert in privacy, technology, and corporate responsibility. Professor Martin has also lectured abroad on these issues. We have Professor Marc Mckenna, the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law and Faculty Director of our program on IP and Technology Law here at Notre Dame. He's also the founding director of Notre Dame's Tech Ethics Center and has taught in Italy at the University of Turin as part of the World Intellectual Property Organization's Master of Laws in Intellectual Property. From the University of Padua, we welcome Professor Lamberto Ballan, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Padua. Professor Ballan has also been a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford. We have Professor Giuseppe Sartori, full professor of cognitive neuroscience and forensic neuropsychology and psychopathology, and a prolific scholar in this area. And we have Dr. Elisa Spiller, a postdoctoral researcher at the AI Society, whose research focuses on the impact of big data on constitutional democracy and fundamental rights protection. And she's also been a visiting scholar at Wake Forest. So without further ado, and looking forward to this great discussion today, I give the floor to Professor Andrea Pin.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Felicia. It's a pleasure. Normally in Italy, we would say the American is ahead, but this time it's reverse because painfully Italy is ahead in fighting coronavirus through the app, tracing app. And this has been a huge debate, which has come across several months. So in March or April, we'll be debating the opportunity and the chances that an app will allow us to move from social distancing, from lockdown to technological distancing. So exploiting technology to resurrect our social life and the economy. So we had great expectations that this would help the economy and society at large. And we understand that this is something that is of interest for other countries, including the United States now. And in a few months, the landscape has changed dramatically. So we have some 20 countries in Europe now, within the EU, that have an app, or either are still developing that, with very mixed results. In some countries, they were very fortunate, like Germany. There are something more than 80 million people, and more than 50 million people downloaded the app. In other countries like Italy or France, though they didn't have such good luck, because in France, just 2 million out of 60 million decided they would download the app. And actually, somebody just disinstalled that because they didn't like it. Some other countries decided they would take down the app altogether because of the size of data that they were storing in mobile phones or even within the cloud. And that was not proportional because they weren't working. They were detective contagion. And this is not something unique within Europe. So if you take Australia, 25 million inhabitants, 60 million people downloaded the app. So quite successful move. But just few contagions were traced through the app. So this has been very, very long debate, but about nothing. So is it being such an unfortunate series of events that took us from expecting so much from the app to being so much disillusioned about the app? And this is something that I understand is valuable for you, for other countries nowadays, since everybody's trying to keep up with the economy, return back to normal life, and everybody knows that while we understand lockdown should be short, an app won't go away. So there are legal variations, there are technological variations, and also cultural variations blended together in the issue of app, of using tracing apps. This is why we have a collaboration among scholars of disciplines to discuss the debate today. Different disciplines in areas of the world, of course. So with no further ado, I'll give the floor back to Felicia, who will be introducing the next speakers. I can't help but saying that it's quite a change to see that an Italian-American student who I lectured 6 years ago is now running this program. So congratulations, Felicia, and the floor is yours again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to work with all of you in this great group of colleagues and to explore these issues together. So I will turn the floor now to Professor Lamberto Ballan, who is an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Padua. And Lamberto will speak on the digitization of the war on COVID-19, the technological angle.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are now. So in these 5 minutes, hopefully, I'll try to give just a very quick overview of some of the technological aspects behind most of the applications, contact tracing applications that have been developed around the world in the last months. And obviously, I will mostly refer to the case of Immuni app, that is the application that has been developed for Italy. And but actually, the principles, so the technological elements that have been used for Immuni are common to most of the applications, at least developed in Europe. And so, first of all, but I think that the interesting, some of the most interesting things from my point of view are that these technological choices that have been made have been guided mostly by some ideas or also some directions coming from actually from law or from privacy concerns. And so this actually has an impact also on the outcomes that this application can guarantee. So then, talking about Immuni, what are the main elements and the main issues? Well, first of all, as probably all of you are well aware, the key idea is to have an application, so a smartphone application, that can help people to understand, especially the governments and also the people in healthcare, to have an instrument that can guide the contact tracing task that usually is done manually or by interviewing people. So basically, the idea is that through your app, so for Italy, the Immuni app, if a sufficient amount of people is using the app, then the app will be able to store, to record events of likely events of contact between people that are likely to be infected by COVID. So basically what's going to happen is that if you have installed the application on your phone, and this is from a technological point of view, this is based on a particular technology that is BLE, so basically Bluetooth, so the same technique, basically the same techniques that are used for using multiple devices, to connect multiple devices to your smartphone, such as, I don't know, your car, if you want to use, to speak to the car instead of using the phone while you're driving, or your, or whatever. So, but basically then, in this context, Bluetooth is used to estimate the distance between two different smartphones. So at the end, so this is very simple application at the end. So what it's doing is that by measuring the distance between the signals that has been, let's say, produced by the two different phones, my app, in this case, will be able to store all the people that have been come close to me, and this close means in a range of around 10 meters, at least for the Immuni app, in the last days. And somewhere this information is going to be stored. Then, so this is, that's it, basically. Obviously, then the fact that this application is going to be useful or not depends on multiple things. So first of all, if nobody is using it, obviously this is not going to help at all. And this is the first problem, as also Andrea was previously briefly mentioning. So for example, Immuni, with respect to other apps also in Europe, such as, for example, in Germany, Immuni, I think that the last figures tells us that almost 4 million, between 4 million and 5 million people in Italy have downloaded that. There are several studies saying that this is going to be really an application such as this one is going to be helpful if at least 50%, some people say that there is no real, obviously it's not clear here what is the real number, but approximately the numbers that have been found to be the most likely numbers leading to a successful application are around the 60% or 65%, maybe less, of the population. So in the case for Italy, this means that in order to have something that is really successful, we are way far from it. Obviously, this is just an average. So actually, it might be also that the application, because at the end, what is really important is that this percentage of people, at least, is reached in some, even in some part of Italy, for example. So it might be that even if on average, this, as we know very well, COVID in Italy had very different, it's been really different in some parts of Italy with respect to others. So, for example, if now, hopefully, we are far from the numbers that we had a few months ago, but if we think to, for example, at Bergamo or in general to the Milan area, a few months ago, we had really numbers that was really scary. So in that case, it might be that even if on average, the percentage of people that are using an app such as Immuni is not that, that huge, but if this is localized in that area, it might be helpful. So this is just to say that, it might also be that in the future, even if, as it seems to be the case, at least in Italy, we will not reach that number of people using the app. It might be that in certain situation or in localized area, this might be useful in any case. And so that's just about the number of people that are using it. Obviously, just another quick, I want to throw another aspect, then maybe we can talk about this later on. So another important thing that I have to say from a technical point of view is that this technology, so basically the idea that we are using Bluetooth to estimate the proximity between two different persons, is one of the options that are possible. And so this choice, for example, in Europe, especially at the beginning of the emergency, almost all the countries agreed on a common pan-European strategy that later on has been followed by only some of the European countries. Well, this choice has been one of the fundamental choices that has been shared among all the partners. If we look to other countries, such for example South Korea, where this contact tracing application that is not that different from a technology, from the application point of view, if we compare this to Immuni, in that case they use it, and it worked quite well in that context. From the technological point of view, that app used also slightly different techniques, and in particular, in that case, the application is based not only on Bluetooth, but also on GPS. And this is the other main issue that actually here there are a lot of privacy concerns, because the fact, and this is also, has been also a huge debate in Italy, because since the very beginning, especially in newspapers, there's been a lot of discussion about the implication in terms of privacy of Immuni, in this case. But actually, the actual protocol that has been developed is not that, I'm not particularly worried about that, because we are not using GPS for that. And for example, if you use Google Maps, you are constantly tracked by your GPS position. So actually, a lot of people that usually, and that probably are not using or installing, but this is probably something that is going to be covered by Professor Sartori later on, but a lot of people that probably are not using or installing the app because of privacy concerns, maybe they are using, I don't know, Face App to change their age or gender, and so they are throwing away all their data just to play a game, or maybe they are using Google Maps where your GPS data are stored 100% of time. So I think for now, that's the main thing that I wanted to highlight. Maybe then we can, depending on the discussion, maybe we can also talk more in detail about some of the technological aspects. So I will leave the floor to Felicia again.
Thank you so much, Lamberto. You bring up a great point, obviously, about why is it that some people will download the app and others will not, especially in light of the tracking and the data sharing that already happens in other circumstances. So this is a great opportunity for Professor Sartori to intervene with the psychology of technology and contact tracing. Professor Sartori is a full professor of cognitive neuroscience and forensic neuropsychology and psychopathology at the Università di Padova. But before I turn it over to Professor Sartori, I just want to mention to our audience that if you have questions, you can email them to aisociety.unipd, that's UNIPD, @gmail.com. So please send us your questions as they arise. Professor Sartori, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I have been asked to make some discussion about the psychological aspects of downloading the contact tracing apps. And I will start by signaling that there is, this downloading is what is called an opt-in procedure. So subjects are actively involved in downloading the app. This is a critical aspect because if you have a procedure which is opt-out procedure, then you can have a higher rate of usage. For example, in Italy, we have an opt-out procedure for organ transplantation. In Italy, people give organs, kidney, liver for transplantation at a higher rate than anywhere else in Europe or in the US. And the reason is that unless you opt out, then you will be a candidate for organ transplantation when it is the moment. So this is the one critical issue which is very important. It is required an active activity from the subject that is required to download the app. Then the second psychological factor that I see involved is the so-called risk perception stage. In the early stages of the coronavirus, then people are prepared to have a strong limitation of their liberty, like, for example, the lockdown. But once the perceived risk of transmission is lowered, then other feature come on the overall evaluation, like, for example, the privacy. In the lockdown, in the high risk of transmission period, then these other concerns are more limited, and people are prepared to have a great limitation on their movement, for example. And a third important characteristic, I think, is the personality of populations. Personality of population refers to differences that are among population. Personality is the difference, for example, in extroversion, in agreeableness. These differences are characteristic from person to person. We are used to say that each of us has his specific personality. The scientific investigation has shown that also at population level, you have a personality, average personality differences. So, for example, some people from southern Italy are more extroverted than people from northern Italy, and it has been proved with big data assessment of personality. And this, I think, is an important factor in modulating the overall rate of download of the app. So at least I identify three psychological features which are involved, and I don't think that we have any research in evaluating the weight of each of these dimensions in the resulting download rate of the app. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sartori. Your observations, of course, about the role that culture plays in the app leads very well into a comparative analysis and our move to the United States perspective. And so I would now turn the floor to Professor Marc Mckenna, Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School and the Faculty Director of our Program on IP and Technology Law and the Founding Director of the Notre Dame Tech Ethics Center. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, you may send them to aisociety.unipd@gmail.com. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Felicia. So I should just say, Andrea, at the beginning, when you talked about how you would normally say that the United States was ahead. So the US has absolutely no national tracking not even a strategy or a thought about doing that, not even at the regional level. So all of the discussion about any kind of tracking and tracing that's happening in the United States is happening on like an employer or sort of hyper regional basis. So, so there's been extensive discussion about a tracking and tracing system at Notre Dame, but that's about how localized it is, which would tell you something, I think, about its effectiveness on a global scale. So I just thought I would follow up on some of those excellent comments by talking just for a second about one of the many reasons why this kind of technology might or might not be effective is that there's a strong tendency, I think, for especially people who work in the technology area to feel as if there's always going to be a technology solution to any serious problem, right? And that we sometimes have substantial overconfidence in that, and it can ignore the context of the use of the technology in two different ways. One of which is that context can really affect the efficacy of the technology. So just to take one obvious example, if you were talking about an app that was going to be used for contact tracing, does that the use of that depend on voluntary downloading and use of the technology? And if it does, then you have exactly the sorts of questions that many of you have raised, which is what incentives or disincentives are there to downloading and using it? And you're going to, I think, see pretty substantial variation among different communities, right? So it's no surprise to me that the highest compliance there would be in Germany. It's also seems very unlikely to me in certain places, certainly in the United States, that you'd get widespread adoption of something like that. And that's, of course, even if you're just talking about downloads, and certainly downloads are not use, right? Even if you get people to download the application, doesn't mean they'll actually use it or keep it on in an effective way. So I think the other really important question there is where does the data that makes these apps effective come from? By which I mean, you can have a terrific app that's able to identify within 10 meters of whether you've come in contact with somebody, but it doesn't do you any good if all the app does is tell you that you've been in contact with some person. You need to know some characteristics of that person, and namely whether that person is positive or not. So how does the app know? How does it know when I've come in contact with Felicia, whether she is tested positive? Again, does that depend on her voluntary self-report of that information, or is that information fed from a health authority that maybe involuntarily sort of supplies the information? Those are really different in terms of efficacy. They're probably also really different in terms of the kinds of privacy concerns that they raise and in terms of people's resistance to the technology. I'll come back to this in a second when I talk about Notre Dame system, but one of the, insofar as that information comes from voluntary self-reports, how do you police its accuracy, right? So there are lots of reasons why people might or might not enter that information honestly. What incentives do you have to get for people to give the right answers under those circumstances? And of course, if we can't assume a very high level of honesty in the information, then no matter how good the technology is at identifying our proximity, it's not going to be worthwhile. What other kinds of concerns would users have about what's being done with that app? In what ways is it being connected to Facebook, right? And what ways is it being, and I think at least we would find in the United States that often people's understanding of what's happening in the sharing of their data beyond the immediate, that understanding is often very shallow. And so I think there likely to be lots of suspicion. So there was a nice discussion just a minute ago that Lamberto was talking about the difference with the South Korean technology. And so I think it's probably useful for us to say that South Korea's tracking and tracing has been extraordinarily successful. It's been also massively more invasive than I think certainly people in the United States and many people in Europe would ever accept in terms of the way that they monitor it. So we often tend to think in those terms, right? There's a sort of trade-off between efficacy on the one hand and then privacy or other kind of broader ethical concerns on the other. But I just want to suggest that, and I don't mean to say that trade-off isn't sometimes real, but that what I was talking about the sort of context of use and the way, what gives people the incentives to use or not use, I think suggests that those the considerations about efficacy are not actually entirely unrelated to questions about privacy or ethical concerns, right? So people's concerns about what's going to happen with their data strongly influence their uptake of technology and their willingness to participate with it, right? For what purposes will the data be used, I think drives a lot of people's suspicion of that kind of technology in the United States at very different political motivations, but I think people have a lot of those concerns. And then even apart from what happens with the data, I think there are legitimate concerns about what happens with the technology now that we know it exists, right? There's a strong tendency, I think, for technology that gets deployed for one purpose to then wind up sort of having mission creep and being used for lots of other purposes, right? And so does this just become a proof of concept for our ability to follow people in general, and then it gets deployed for other kinds of purposes? So I'll just say locally that we've been thinking about kind of all of those things as Notre Dame has been trying to figure out what type of tracking and tracing system it's going to use as part of its return to campus strategy. We've had the opportunity to participate in some of that. And I will say that for many of the reasons I described, Notre Dame has basically adopted the position that they're going to use technology-enabled human tracking and tracing, by which I mean there's going to be a health monitoring app that asks people to voluntarily input information, and the technology will help humans make sense of that data and figure out what to do with it. But they've explicitly decided not to adopt a tracking app like the one that you've all described in Italy that would use technology to actually locate people and identify when they've been in contact with each other. They did that in part because of some concerns that many students expressed about what would happen with that information. So just to take one example, Notre Dame has single-sex dorms, and there are certain hours during which men and women are not allowed to be in each other's dorms. What would happen if it were disclosed either through a piece of technology or information that was disclosed by a person in order to help the tracking and tracing that they had violated those rules, right? Those would ordinarily result in substantial discipline at the university, including sometimes being expelled from the dorms. If you want students to answer these questions honestly, and you want it to actually work as a tracking and tracing technology, if they don't have confidence that that information will not reach the residence life side of the university, they're not going to be honest about the information that they provide. Same with, going off campus. And then even just more, maybe not innocuously, but maybe less in terms of sort of student discipline. All of the faculty and staff will be expected to complete these health assessments in the morning as well. Many of our employees work hourly. And if they report themselves as having any of the symptoms and they lose hours and don't get paid for them, there's a strong incentive to think, maybe it's a little bit of a fever, but I think I'm probably okay. And so I say all of that just to say that you can have the greatest technology in the world, but if you haven't really thought about the sort of social system in which that technology is going to be deployed, it will undermine the effectiveness of it in the first place, and maybe even have sort of unintended consequences. So I think I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much, Marc. Those points also about incentivization and efficacy, of course, within the framework of, as you say, a lack of national idea for contact tracing as opposed to Italy, also bring up the issues, right, of privacy and the privacy law in the different jurisdictions, and GDPR versus our evolving privacy law in the United States. And so a great moment to give the floor to Dr. Elisa Spiller, who will speak about the hard legal choices for Europe, the legal angle of tracing apps from the European and the Italian perspective. And just as a reminder, if we have any new audience members, you can send questions to aisociety.unipd@gmail.com.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you to all for this very stimulating discussion. So I'd like to refer into some remarks given by Professor Ballan, Professor Sartori, and Professor Mckenna. And I'd like to give a context to Immuni experience to show what could be the Italian lesson and the European lesson about content tracing apps for the global debates about these technologies. So, as Lamberto said before, Immuni is a sort of is the result of a series of technical and political choices that were deeply influenced by the European regulation about data protection. So the choice of Bluetooth technology, the choice of voluntary download, as well as other technical features concerning the way that the data are stored in the people mobile phone and whatever, were deeply influenced by EU law data protection regulation. And why we have this influence from EU law at national level and even globally for all these issues concerning data protection, because data protection is a fundamental right of the European Union. And it is a genuine milestone of European constitutional identity and fundamental rights strategies. So this is the reason why we have, for all the 27 member states, a unique regulation that is immediately applicable. And this regulation is living a sort of a stress test with the coronavirus, because all the technologies that member states aim to use to contrast the spread of the virus somehow have something concerning data protection. And so European legislation have a direct impact in the national choices about the use of these apps. So all the European institutions stress that data protection is not an obstacle to saving lives and to break the chain of transmission of the virus. And the legal framework that we have was designed to be flexible and to achieve an effective response to the pandemic and protecting human fundamental rights and freedom. But the problem that we are living is the following. The EU law provides a unitary framework, while national legal tradition of the single member state sometimes differs. And we have differences in the way that we perceive general interest and individual rights. As Professor Sartori said before, we have a sort of conflicts between individual freedom and collective interest. And if we have strong limitation imposed by public authorities, that is a sort of mandatory limitation. On the other hand, when we try to relieve from and to come back to a new normal with these kinds of apps, we have people with lower perception of the risk, and so we have to tackle with the issues concerning the bad or good use of their freedoms. And so these national prerogatives, at the very beginning, at least in Europe, opted for different technologies. So we know that there were different solutions, not just about the different model concerning contact tracing apps, but even concerning the different technologies suitable to avoid the further spread of the disease. But gradually we saw that under the moral suasion of the European institution, we have a sort of convergence among these different options. And generally now we have not properly a uniform scenario, but the most of national contact tracing application opted for an homogeneous standard concerning the use of anonymized data, proximity data instead of location data, voluntary application download instead of mandatory legal basis, and many other choices that were explained in the previous contribution. So what is interesting to look at about this scenario is that we have a Brazil effect within the European Union and even outward the European Union. If the member states have to tackle with the guidelines, have to implement these guidelines in the national legislation and this limits their choice, their political and technological choice about the features and the use of this application. On the other hand, just last month on the 16th of June, we agreed on technical standard for the interoperability of these different applications within the European Union. And the aim of the World Health Organization is to achieve this result, these interoperability standards, even with non-EU country, because health surveillance is something that could be really helpful in containing the virus. But this ethical and legal choice made by the European Union concerning the technical and legal aspects concerning data protection may have a disruptive impact in the comparison with other legal systems and other legal cultures. Instead, the choice that we did are related to our traditions, so this individualized reading of data protection and of fundamental rights. And in a moment like the one that we are living, this choice can conflict with other sensibilities, legal sensibilities and cultural sensibilities about the pandemics and in general the exercise of rights and freedom. So these are the main points that I think we should use in our reflection today. And so I leave you the floor, Felicia. Thank you.
Elisa, thank you so much. Of course, you bring up the ethical component and how connected these legal decisions are to individual cultures and the traditions of legal systems. And so that also brings up ethics and how norms in society shape our use of the app and contact tracing more generally, which leads into Professor Kirsten Martin's comment and presentation on ethics and contact tracing, the challenges ahead as we think to the future and what all of these observations mean. Professor Martin is a professor of tech ethics in the Mendoza College of Business here at Notre Dame, and she's also affiliated with the Tech Ethics Center. So I give the floor to you, Professor Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for pulling this together. I really appreciate it. It's interesting to see how different the reaction is to contact tracing. I'm going to talk about two different areas. One is about just general trust with technology and industry. But first I want to talk a little bit about a recent study on location data. Only small bits of it. So most contact apps are not location-based. However, some are, and so that ends up painting a broad brush on all contact apps. What was interesting, so Helen Niesenbaum and I did a study on location data and the tracking and tracing of location data. And there's a few interesting things I think for contact tracing apps. One is that when we only use the term location, we did a pre-study, and it turns out when people hear the term location, they associate that with GPS data. It's not a generalized Bluetooth handshake. If they hear the term location, they think very precise tracking as to who they are. And so that was one point that we should always remember when we use the term location or any type of locating of a person using their phone. People internalize that as being extremely specific. Second, people are actually quite nuanced about location data and who should have it and for what purpose. They differentiated between your employer versus your family getting it, the FBI, like a federal agency getting your data, a city for general services. They were really nuanced about it. And they also were worried about how you might place them. So there was a difference when we added, and they could locate you at this location. So going back to Marc's point about locating someone in a dorm when you're at a university, that was really important to people. They were okay with GPS location tracking in general, but once you started locating them at a specific place, they became upset and it did not meet the privacy expectations. So that's something to remember. What people are worried about is locating them in a place. And then if you ever were to say about inferences drawn about them, like, and they'd be able to tell if you voted or not, or they'd be able to tell if you were at a protest, then all of a sudden any type of GPS location tracking did not meet their privacy expectations. So they are nuanced, except in one circumstance that's interesting. And that is if the data aggregator ever got a hold of that data. And if a data aggregator was ever mentioned in the scenario, then all nuance was gone and it never met their privacy expectations. This is fairly consistent across studies on privacy expectations, is that the introduction of a third-party data aggregator skews everything. They just all of a sudden, if there's a slider, they slide it to the left and say, this does not meet my privacy expectations. And the reason why this is, I think, important for contract tracing is that stories did start to come out about questions about where the data was going. And this gets to the second point, is around when people don't have trust in an individual company, like there's no branding of a contract tracing app. If there isn't a strong national mandate saying this is ours, we are, for example, Germany, we are Germany, and this is our contract tracing. And so they impute the trust in Germany's government onto the app, or trust in the system, if it was from us and the CDC, onto the app. Then people usually start trusting the institution or the industry. So if you think of a contact tracing app industry, what ends up happening is the stories that come out of, for example, Norway, when they had to stop data gathering because they were found to be collecting too much information and they couldn't tell where it was going, that in effect dirties the industry. So when we've done other studies where if you tell stories about tracking and tracing online, people begin, even if they're not a part of it, to distrust the industry in general. And we find that institutional trust starts going down. And so part of the problem that people now are facing in introducing contact tracing apps is overcoming the bad negative stories of countries reversing themselves, going one way and then another, saying they're doing one thing, and then it turns out they're actually developing and getting GPS location data that's being held centrally. So all of those stories culminate to a general distrust in the industry, which is now harder to overcome. So if it was hard in May, it's even harder now. And so I think if I were to say what the expectations of privacy would be around contract tracing, would be the idea of the Bluetooth handshake is something that most people would find okay, especially if it was promised that they were not going to be able to be tracked down to a place or a GPS location. But the fact that it was muddied with GPS location data in the beginning would cause, based on our surveys, which was a national survey, would cause people great concern, especially if we don't exactly know where the information would be going and who would be using it. They also were pretty specific, certain things, especially in the United States, which were considered fundamental rights like voting or protests and association. Those were much more sensitive for people as to having their location tracked. And so if we aren't really specific about how the government or a third party is going to be using this data, if they are worried and hear stories, for example, in the United States just recently, there was a story about location data being used to locate people at a protest, then all of that gets muddied in location data tracking. And so so the location data and their concerns around that, plus the muddying of the water of trusting just in apps in general, makes the idea of a contact tracing app more difficult unless it was early on established that it was heavily branded within a trusted institution, because otherwise they don't know what this app is. And that just goes back to ideas in industry about institutional trust or trust in an industry. And then second, whether or not it was really clearly disassociated from GPS and location tracking, because that's one area that people have a lot of concerns. And it's also a type of data that's stickier, that will stick around longer. It could be used in a different way. And that's what people are most concerned about, because that's how that type of data could actually come back to harm them. And that's really, those are my two thoughts on contact tracing, and like, given what we know about location data and trust in technology, what the hurdles might be to having an adaptation of contact tracing.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin. Those are such interesting points when you think about the understanding of the term location as you've explored in your research. So Andrea, I know that you have received perhaps one or two questions from our audience. So if you'd like to ask it of the roundtable.
Sure. So let me ask the first question, which is for Professor Sartori. So the question is from Sophia from Notre Dame Law School, straight from South Bend. Professor Sartori, what would you say are the factors that affect an individual's risk perception, and how it may change over time, like the willingness to stay inside? Is that due largely to personality? So it's mostly about personality and risk perception and how circumstances change that.
Okay, the risk perception and the risk propensity is a personality dimension, which is which may be different from subject to subject. So this is certainly one dimension. For example, risk perception is high on people who have a personality called external locus of control. So there are a number of personal dimensions which are linked, and then there are general factors, like, for example, that the perceived risk may vary according to the stage of the diffusion of the coronavirus. So also the influence of other person, how other people behave, can modulate the personal perception of risk. For example, if I go around and see everybody with a mask, I can have a higher perception of risk, but rather if I see everybody without a mask, I can lower my threshold of risk. So there are a number of dimensions that can be involved in this risk perception issue.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. We have another question, though. I think that the best person to ask this question is Elisa. Elisa Spiller. So it's about UNIPD, so it's about our university. Does UNIPD plan to have a comeback strategy for September, also based on tracking app? The answer is no. I'll tell you in a minute, but based on what Professor Ballan said about the possible local efficacy of Immuni, which is the Italian app, although on average may not be effective on the national level, could be the mandatory use of Immuni by UNIPD, so by this university, or part of them, enough to effectively track and protect by potential new seed of COVID. From the legal point of view, would this mandatory use forced by the university be compatible with Italian law and GDPR?
If I may, I just would like to say that this is so inspiring because we see the practices, right, of Notre Dame that Marc described, inspiring a question about how the University of Padua will use contact tracing. So this particular question, I have to say, warms my heart. But
we have a copyright issue here, but in a moment. So before I give the floor to Elisa, let me just emphasize that we had this discussion here. So we thought of having an app. I don't know whether Lamberto wants to add something also, but they decided that would not have a app for several reasons, among which there's a legal point of view. And I'll give the floor to Elisa first.
Thank you. So these are very inspiring questions. So yes, UNIPD doesn't have an application for contact tracing for the comeback strategy, but other universities are considering to use not contact tracing application, but other data-driven solution to help the comeback strategies in September. So about the question about Immuni, we can have a mandatory use of Immuni from a private or public institution, because by law it is a voluntary download application. And so I suppose that even in light of what Data Protection Authority at national level and even at the European one suggests about the voluntary nature of this application, a university such as our one or any others cannot force their students to download the app, even if this requirement could give more effective results in the content tracing practice. And this last part of my answers, I suppose, answer even the last question. So, especially in employment and labor law, there are many questions about the use of private contact tracing apps. Immuni is a national contact tracing app, and so it is sponsored and authorized by the Italian government, while other companies and even other public institutions such as the civil protection, I don't know the correct translation in English, but the health force that are managing the COVID emergency developed their own application with different strategies and partially different choices compared with Immuni. It's not clear now if the use of alternatives and the mandatory requirements of a contact tracing app would be compliant with Italian law and especially with the guidelines given by the European Data Protection Board and European Data Protection Authority. But the idea to sponsor the voluntariness of this application is related with the kind of relationship that public authorities and even private ones should have with their counterparts in the use of this application. Voluntariness is a form to ensure a voluntary and aware involvement of people in the fight against coronavirus and in the use of their data. So a mandatory requirement would be in contrast with this premise.
Thank you, Elisa. There's an aspect of a question that I think Lamberto could address properly. Before giving the floor to Lamberto, I think that I would like to explore another angle with Giuseppe in a moment once Lamberto is over, which is so many universities here and other institutions are trying to market themselves. So they are trying to invite students, to encourage students to enroll in their programs and restart normal life. So given the fact that an app has not been so successful here, would a mandatory app be helpful or counterproductive in terms of inviting people to join university? But I will keep that question. That might be interesting also for Americans to wait for a while. I give the floor to Lamberto. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, actually, I would say something that is directly related to what you were saying and also, let's say, asking now. Because I mean, first of all, regarding the UniPD app, I mean, you are probably more, you know more than me, but I think that it's interesting anyway that I mean, I know that there have been a long debate and also things are changing exactly regarding this idea of having an app, an internal app of UniPD for the same reasons that probably Notre Dame is implementing one. But actually, at least the last version that I heard has something that is probably between what we say till now, because this is where I, let's say, follow what you were saying, because since in October, we are trying to, at least for people starting the program, so, and I mean both bachelor and also master program, we are trying to guarantee, at least in part, that some of them can attend in class, so in person. It might be that the app, at least this is what we are discussing in our department, it might be that the app at the end will be a simple app that is used basically to say that you are going to attend the class, right? And so this is because obviously, depending on the size of the class and all the limitations that we have in order to, guarantee that people are not too close to each other. So at the end, how the lecturer will be able to guarantee that there are not too much people in class, right? So at the end, what I think is going to be done is that you have an application where you basically say, okay, I'm going there for the next class, and so there is a limited amount of people that can attend that particular class, and so at the end, basically, and so the teacher, the lecturer, at the end will know that that number has been reached, right? Because we're not going to ask to everyone to say, okay, I'm in class, I'm not. So at the end, this is something that is very close to the location service that we were talking about previously, even if in a probably coming from a slightly different angle, let's say. And this just to say that at the end, really this topic, this issue about location versus proximity, I think is a really important one. So I think that most of the things that were have been covered previously, especially by many of you, I think are really important, and probably is also one of the reasons why, especially since the beginning, the Immuni, at the end, why has not been downloaded by much people, because immediately most of the people think that this proximity means that everyone will, some people will know that, like the example of the dorm that have been done previously, but actually this is not something that can be done with Immuni, for example, right?
Thank you, Lamberto. So I give the floor to Giuseppe, but after Giuseppe, I'd like to engage our American friends, so Kirsten and Marc, because my understanding is that at least theoretically, we can think of an app that you might require students to download, at least on a theoretical level. And from an Italian point of view, from a European point of view, I understand that having students go back to campus is critical, especially for American culture of campuses, right? So how would you handle that? My understanding is that American legal mindset, American culture is very skeptical about public powers, whereas it's more confident that private powers will treat them in a certain way. Whereas the European mindset is, let's say, the reverse. We're very skeptical about private powers. So I will engage you after listening to Giuseppe. Giuseppe?
Yeah. My feeling is that as regards to the strategies that increase in order to increase the adoption of the app, the opt-out strategy that is used for organ transplantation is a winner, because it leaves the option of the subject to not to adopt it, and has a legal ground, I think, because at least in Italy it is legal. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know exactly the legal arguments why unless you declare explicitly you don't want to have your liver transplanted, they are going to transplant your liver once you are brain dead. But I think that is a strategy that will increase dramatically the adoption. For example, imagine that every time that you have to upgrade your operating system then automatically downloads the contact tracing app. And then if you want, you opt out. I think that the strategy also for the university and in every field is the winner.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Long story short, when they framed the GDPR, they decided they rejected the opt-out approach. So that's a legal paradox, but that's how it works. I give the floor to Kirsten and Marc.
I think it depends on the framework. Because if you frame it as a technology issue, then that is relevant. But if you frame it as a public health issue, that is another problem.
I understand, sure. Floor goes to Marc, I would say, first, and then Kirsten.
So I think your observation of that Americans are sort of disposed to being skeptical of public authorities is true. I think Kirsten's excellent comments earlier, though, I mean, I think there are reasons to think that Americans are skeptical of all big power, at least absent particular reasons to be trusting of them. So I would think that the sort of like worst possible combination in the United States would be a combination of a government mandated piece of technology that was developed by Google and Apple. Like, I think that would be deeply skeptical. But I think, and Kirsten, you should jump in and tell me if you think I'm right about this, but I do think that pockets of trust, like, so I expect the compliance with, so Notre Dame students and faculty will have an app. It will not be an app that tracks your location or your proximity to other people, but it will require inputting of health check-in information every day. I expect the campus compliance with that to be extremely high. And I think the reason is because the trust within the Notre Dame community is very high, and the Notre Dame endorsement of that piece of technology, absent some reason to be distrustful of it, I think it will be high. I don't think that will answer all of the questions about people's competing incentives to input information, but I don't think that there'll be resistance to it as a matter of principle. But I think that's consistent with the idea that it's really the trustworthiness of the institution that is driving that. So I think that there would be opportunities, even within the United States, for development of similar kinds of things within local communities, within particular companies, whether that would be adequate on a community basis to actually make a real impact, or if it's just a way of, as you mentioned, like, American universities are unique, especially a place like Notre Dame, in that they're so residential, right? So that there's so much more about the community of this place that is in some ways separable from the broader community, which would not generally be true of employers, for example.
Thank you very much. The spirit of comradeship you mentioned. Please.
No, I was just gonna, I think Marc's right. I think, in fact, part of the suggestion for Notre Dame is that we shouldn't be going to other communities right now. I mean, so part of the thing, I just went through something this morning before coming on here where I checked off that I would be a good member of the health community here. And one of them is you're not going to travel and go anywhere else, or like that you're going to limit it and be thoughtful about entering into other communities. And that's something that we have to really think about. And so it's really kind of very defined community. I agree with you. I also agree, though, that I often wondered why the mandate or why the bottleneck of suggesting didn't come from specific companies. So if I were to go to my grocery store, I didn't have to show that I was using a contact tracing app. What India, I noticed, had, it was a decent amount of the number of people have smartphones, but not that many people have smartphones in India. But one of the reasons they said was that workplaces were mandating and to use their metro, their train system, and any public transportation, that you had to have the contact tracing app. So there are other ways than the government. I mean, the public transportation is obviously the government, but it gets people at a point where they could choose not to use it, I suppose, and then they don't have to use that company or go to that grocery store. I do notice there's wide variation of mask wearing in the United States. And a lot of that is just dictated by the private entity saying whether or not it's mandated. So if you go to a store where it's mandated, everyone wears it. If you go to a place where it's not mandated, everyone takes them off and they don't use them. So there's much more focus on what the private entity is telling you to do here rather than what the government is telling you to do. And that could be because our government right now is split. Like we have half of the people saying do something and then the other half saying don't do something. So that's part of the United States problem right now, is that even if you had a distrust of government right now, they're not on the same page. So you wouldn't know who to trust anyway. Or maybe you would, but half the people aren't trusting those people. But I agree with you that private industry is another place to go as a pressure point as to why you have to use a contact tracing app. Because doing it at the state level or the US or the government level doesn't always work.
I think the uptake would have to be, I mean, the example of the public transportation in India is an excellent one, because like the choice not to use it is such a painful one, right? It's like there are so few good alternatives to it. So one of the things about the mask wearing in like the United States, I think it's true there's wide divergence. I sort of wonder whether it's the stores that are driving norm compliance, or if it's what's just happening is just that people are sorting into the people who would otherwise like to wear masks and want to be in a place that are wearing masks are going to certain stores, and the people who are skeptical of masks are going to the other stores. And so we're just providing them means of kind of like separating themselves rather than driving it. Having said that, I will say the mask compliance locally here is very visibly up from 2 weeks ago. So maybe that's a good sign.
Thank you. I would say one more question, since we are speaking about apps. What would be the best way to build an app? Because Lamberto and Elisa explained to us how an app was built here. One of the aspects that really struck me was that it was built up in partnership with the authorities that patrol privacy here. This has been the case everywhere within the EU. How would you envision the process of building an app properly? Kirsten and Marc.
Kirsten, you want to take that one first? I think I would say we would have to go back in time and for 40 years and build civic identity in the United States and belief in, and absent a time machine, I'm not sure it's possible. So,
yeah, I think the best, I think one of the best ways is to get skeptics on board early. So if you have, privacy focused, like if you had the ACLU in the United States on board with a specific app, that would give a lot of credibility to people who are normally very suspect of any type of technological innovation that's going to track you. So I think you'd have to find, odd people who don't normally side with technologists on their side to kind of convince them. I know that made a difference when I would see privacy scholars get on board with a specific app. A guy I know, Michael Veal, who's in the UK, and when he was involved with their suggestion, that gave credibility. And so I think if you had naysayers to be able to say it, and also a lot of transparency early on. The problem is if it's not transparent and it's just kind of like, well, you should just trust me, I'm not going to tell you what's going on, that people just know that doesn't work. And part of the problem is then when you are transparent, it's almost too late. So if you go back in time, it would almost be, getting a certain amount of trust on your brand of the contact tracing app early with, normal skeptics on board, and also 100% in complete transparency as to what you were doing. But I think Marc's right when I think sometimes government, at least the United States government officials, get swayed by technologists who just say, just trust me and I'm gonna, build this great app. I think I saw in Texas, there was a app that they spent $300 million on it, and the governor was being sued for that. And I think in the UK, their app cost them like $1 million. Or something like, it was just, the difference was huge. And so I think that just shows the technologists getting in the brain of saying, I can just build you something big and it'll track everything. And you have to just keep them away, and almost oddly enough, bring the ACLU in or someone like that and have them vouch for you.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to Felicia to conclude, I'd like just to emphasize one among the many things I've learned today. And this is something that Giuseppe said at the outset, that sometimes time runs against the project, because the more time elapses, the more you're able to fight the virus, the least perceptive people will be about the necessity of having an app. And therefore there will be less confident that an app will work and will be necessary. So in this terms, it's also a matter of strategy, political strategy. So thank you all, and I give the floor to Felicia to conclude.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I just want to say one of many of the common threads I think that have come out of our discussion today are, as Marc just said, the importance of civic identity, in the United States and building it up. But we see the importance of civic identity in the United States and in Italy in terms of how we address contact tracing and how we have been learning to deal with this new normal that we have now. So civic identity, trust, we talked a lot about trust in institutions, trust in government, trust also in ourselves and in others, that we will use an app or that we will follow contact tracing guidelines. The importance of law, norms, and legal traditions. So identifying the fact that the norms and the laws that we apply and that help us develop these apps are very connected to our cultures and to our traditions, and the importance of personality as well in that. So certainly themes and keywords that we can continue to think about as we address these new novel issues that are omnipresent now in our lives. And I'd really like to thank each of the panelists for participating today, and so happy that we could create this joint event between the AI Society and our IP program here at Notre Dame Law School, and look forward to continuing the collaboration and to further events in the future. So thank you all, and thank you so much to the members of our audience who asked questions as well. Round of applause for everyone.